Hello, hopefully everyone can hear me. So this is the Introduction to GraphQL with Go. My name's Dirk. I'll be hosting this evening's DevOps Playground. Before we kick things off, just a little bit of background on the playground itself. So it started back in 2015. It's a community that's grown from 10 people to now over 5,000 worldwide. It's always been our aim to provide a platform to share and collaborate knowledge amongst all our members. We do this by running a monthly technical hands-on session with some of the emerging and popular DevOps and development tools. These playgrounds are sponsored by a company called ECS, for whom I'm a developer. For those of you who haven't heard of ECS, it's a digital transformation consultancy. We adopt agile and DevOps techniques to rapidly upskill teams, accelerate release cycles, and drive meaningful innovation with our skill set covering everything from cloud adoption and digital engineering to data analytics and customer experience. Before we get going, there should be a link to the Slack community channel in YouTube. So we can offer technical support during the playground. If you need to pause this session at any time and go and revisit it, or if you'd like to revisit from tomorrow once it's been pushed to the channel, then feel free to do that. So let's begin. So today we are going to first cover what is GraphQL, a use case. Then we're going to do the exciting bit, the hands-on session, followed by question and answer. So if you have any questions, feel free to stick around to the end, and hopefully I'll attempt at answering them. So first of all, what is GraphQL? So it's a query language for your API. Clients can ask for exactly what they want, no more, no less. It's organized in terms of types and fields. So the aim is that you should be able to have a single endpoint for your entire application, and then the clients can specify precisely what they're after. So the use case of GraphQL, I mean, it's pretty much any scenario which involves an API. It's easy to use. There's a number of different languages that are already supported, and that's growing. And it's also open source. There are also some powerful UI tools to help you explore your API and to test queries. So we're going to show you that later on as well. So we will first of all generate a basic app structure using a tool called GQL Gen from 99 Designs. Then we're going to write a CRUD capable application, which should hopefully show the possibilities of GraphQL. Quick disclaimer, we're being a bit experimental with the infrastructure that we're providing, so please leave feedback. So I'll just talk you through the app very briefly that we're aiming. So it's come up with a basic flights application. It's a very simple infrastructure. The design. So first of all, you've got the GraphQL. In the middle, we've got the Go code in this case, and then it's talking to a Dynamodb backend, which we hopefully don't need to worry about too much. Usually, if you're writing a proper app, there would probably be a business layer here, but it's trying to be as simple as possible. So you should see in the YouTube description a sign up link, which is this one. This will provide you the details for getting onto the infrastructure. So I would say that there's quite a lot you need to do if you're not using the playground provided infrastructure. So there's a Readme, which I can show you here. So first of all, you need to install Go. You'd need to have an AWS account. You'd need to set up Dynamodb. There's a CloudFormation template that I've provided inside this repo. By the way, this link to GitHub should be public, and it should be on the YouTube description as well. Then you need to set up permissions on 2 different tables in the DynamoDB, install AWS CLI, and create an access key. So if you want to do that, I'd suggest you probably pause the video and get that set up first before continuing. But if you're using the Playground provided infrastructure, then this should be much more straightforward. So here's what you do. If you go to this link that was specified in the PowerPoint, you enter your meetup username. So this is case sensitive. In my case, it's Derek. So this will provide you with your password to log into a command line terminal here. And also we're going to be using VS Code inside a browser here. So if I open this up, helps if I press the right button to copy. Ready, logged in. And then let me open up the IDE as well. So if you have a quick look inside this the terminal, you can see there's a GraphQL folder. So if you cd into that, so you can follow along with this using the Readme. It's helpful to have that in a separate window if you can, or a separate monitor. And then if we list that, you can see there's a folder there which is called Introduction to GraphQL with Go. So that is a pre-cloned down version of this Readme, because there's a couple of files that we'll just need to copy into our solution that we're creating. So because it saves a lot of it's the interaction with the DynamoDB, which is not really the focus of this DevOps. So that's some code that's been written for you. So if we're ready, I think we'll begin. So first of all, if you make a directory called flights, can I just say that this might seem a bit of choppy to begin with, but hopefully it will become clear as we make progress. So then we've made the directory, we've cd'd into it. Now we need to just initialize it quickly. And then we need to retrieve this tool for generating the GraphQL structure, GQLGen. So that might take a little bit of time to download. And then the next step is to initialize it. So you can see here it said that you can start running this server if you want to, a GraphQL server. We're not going to do that just yet. We're going to change a couple of things, but first of all, as I mentioned, we need to copy over a pre-prepared file. So you should just be able to copy and paste this command and run that. So if I go to the VS Code here and then to projects, so you can see what that's done. If we go data layer, so flights, data layer.go, there's a file here that contains all of the interactions with the the DynamoDB. There'll be more on that later, but for now, if you go into graph and then schema.graphqls, open this file. So you can see here, this, just missed that. The generate, or the initialize rather, has created a basic schema. We're actually going to ignore that. We're going to go with the schema that you can copy and paste from down here. So if you just overwrite the contents of the schema.graphqls. So I'll just talk about this quickly. So this is a GraphQL schema. You can have it in multiple files if you like, but for ease, it's all in one file. So here we've got a flight. So the flight number, for example, BA386 or something like that, is just a string. So one of the useful things with GraphQL, you can define strong types. So it will help you with validation for certain things. This exclamation mark just means it's not nullable. The passengers I'll skip over for the moment. Capacity, so this is an integer. Captain, so because this is quite simple, it's just a string, as is the plane. You'd probably want that to be its own type in a fully fledged app. Then if I move down here, we've got another type, so a passenger with an ID and a name. Now this passenger is the same as this passenger up here, so it shows you that you can have, it shows you all the passengers on a particular flight, and the square brackets around it mean it's an array. Now one thing that's quite important you need to specify is this section down here. So this shows you the entry points. It must, all GraphQL schemas must contain a query. So this is, think of it as a select on a database. So it's retrieving some information in a read-only manner. And then optionally, you can also have what's called a mutation. And that means that you are either creating, updating, or deleting data in some way. So you need to have both of those entry points. You can see here that we've specified the query, and in this case it's passengers. So what this will do is return you a list of all passengers. So you can see it's an array of passenger. Then we've also got a mutation, which is creating a passenger. So you need to specify a name for your passenger, and which is a string, non-nullable, and it will return you a passenger object. So the next step, once we've got that mutation, the schema in place, is to run a generate command. So ideally you just copy and paste it from the Readme. This will produce a few scary looking things like validation failed and exit status 1. Don't worry about that. That is okay. If we go skip back into the VS Code and open in Graph Model, there's a models gen. You can see here that this code has been auto-generated, so it's produced a struct in Go World, which is your flight and your passenger. Now, before we continue, we need to update something in the data layer. So this is the file we copied over previously, so it's in flights data layer.go. There's your animal name here. So you need to change this. So you can see in my case, it's a wildcat. So this is, if you go back to the sign up, this is the the animal name that has got your unique animal for this. So you need to change that inside the data layer. Then we can go to schemas.resolvers.go inside the graph folder. And you can see here that it's created this, there's a create passenger function and a passengers function, which have got a panic saying they're not implemented. And if you scroll down a bit further, there's this big warning. So this create to-do and the to-dos was there from the beginning when the project was initialized, the same as that schema. So the warnings that happened when you triggered the generate were because it no longer knows what to do with these. But if you'd implemented them, then it doesn't just want to get rid of the code that you spent time implementing. So it moves them down to the bottom here. But for our purposes, it's perfectly safe just to remove that completely, because we're using a different schema to the one that's initialized. You then need to add an import to the top of the file here. For those who aren't that familiar with Go, there's in VS Code there's often like marketplace add-ons which will do this kind of thing for you. But because we're running it inside a browser, there's a few limitations, so we need to do that manually for here. So now we're going to implement our passengers function. So if you do return.datalayer.get all passengers. So this is a function that is being written for you that's inside the data layer that will query the GraphQL, the Dynamodb. Right. Then the next step is we're ready to try running the GraphQL for the first time. So if I go run server go here, I think it will need to download a few other bits and pieces. And then you can see that it's got this connect to localhost. So that's not the case for this because we're using the playground infrastructure. So it should be something like this. So again, you'll need to change this your animal. So in my case, it's wildcat. And then you should see a nice user interface appear. So this is like a rough equivalent of Swagger that GraphQL provides. You can see here that it provides the complete schema that we saw earlier. There's also documents, so it shows you what queries and what mutations are available. So if you click on passengers, for example, you can see so it's got two field names, ID and name. And there's the types, so it can give you a bit more information about the types and so on. So if I get rid of that. So let's try and run a query. So if you start typing query, and now it's useful to give your query a name because we'll have multiple queries appearing in this window. So if you call it passengers, for example, and then if you start typing, you get some autocomplete options. So you've got passengers there, and then you need the curly braces. And then if you do control space, it will show you like you've got ID and you've got name available for the passengers. So if I run that, you can see that it returns null because we haven't put any passengers inside our Dynamodb table yet. So if you return to the command line and stop that running, so Control C to stop it running, and then return back here, and we now want to implement this create passenger method. So if you do return datalayer.create passenger, and then you need to pass in the name. Now, if I run this at this point, I believe, there will be an error. So Go is quite particular about importing things or declaring a variable, for example, that you are not using. So in this case, it will actually refuse to compile and give an error. So you need to return back to your imports. So what's happened there is we did used to have a statement here that was using the FMT import. That's no longer the case, so you need to just manually remove that from the list of imports here. Again, there's marketplace things available for VS Code, and I'm sure other IDEs have very similar things which will auto remove imports and things like that. So now if we try running it again, you can see it says it's running. If I refresh this page, and I'll write the first mutation. So because we're going to be changing something, let's call it create passenger, and then the mutations that we have available, create passenger. Now the arguments, so you have to specify name, colon, and then let's call the passenger Bob. And we need to show what we want to do with the return item. So if you remember, the create passenger returns a passenger object. So in this case, we can show the ID. So if we click run, create passenger, you can see here that I've got an ID back successfully. So that's good. It shows you that the, so this is just a UUID that's been generated associated with the passenger. And now if I query for passengers again, you can see, here we go, here's Bob that we created just now. So if you remember from our schema, we don't just have passengers, we have flights as well. So if we so let's get some flight data inside our Dynamodb. So to do this, we need to open up the Dynamodb flight data.json. So this is inside the introduction to GraphQL with Go. There's a flight data.json. And then you will need to update this to be your animal name. So again, in my case, it's Wildcat. And you can see here that this is just putting in 2 different flights with a couple of other details. So it should all be available in the VS Code. Now you need to copy and paste this command. You should be able to run that directly from the flights directory that you are currently in. And then you can see, so what this does is it's a way of writing in a few items to the Dynamodb. So you can see this, it's returned this unprocessed items is empty, so that's a good sign. So now we need to modify our schema file to be able to access the flights. So if I return back to our schema file here, you no longer need that flight data.json. Sorry, the schema file here, schema.graphqls. And add a query for retrieving all the flights. Now, because we've changed the schema file, we're going to need to regenerate our program. So run the generate command down here. And if you go to schemas-resolvers.go, you can see a new function has appeared here saying like flights. Okay, how do I implement that? So let's remove that and go return data layer.get all flights. Again, you'll need to remove this fmt that got imported by when the program was being regenerated because of the default behavior to have a not implemented error thrown. So now you can get rid of that. And we can run the server again. Return to this, the user interface, refresh the page. And let's write a new query, so let's call it flights. And then, so you can see here, here's passengers that we had available before, but now we have flights available. So let's query for those. In this case, let's just do quite a simple test. So let's just get the flight number. So you can run that, and you should be able to see the 2 flights that we inserted into the Dynamodb table earlier. So now let's try booking a passenger onto the flight. So if you turn back to the command line and server, and then we'll need to modify Schema File. So we want to be able to book a flight here. So in order to book a flight, you need to provide the flight number, which should be unique, or for this program, I'm going to assume it is unique, and the passenger ID. So obviously in the front end, you wouldn't be expecting someone to be entering a passenger ID, but for this layer, I think it's reasonable to expect the passenger ID there to be entered. So if I add that into our mutation type here, so it means we've got 2 different mutations available. We can create a passenger, as we've done, and we can book a flight. So the next step, because we've changed the schema, we now need to regenerate the Go code. You'll get quite familiar with regenerating over the course of this. And then return back to schemas.resolvers.go. You should be able to see there's a new function that has appeared called book flight. So again, the implementation has been provided inside the data layer. So you go return.data layer book flight. You need to type in the flight number and the passenger ID. And now we've implemented that, we can run our server again. Being caught. So again, you need to just manually remove that FMT from the imports. And then return back to the user interface. And we're going to create a new mutation, which is booking the flight. So book flight, need to specify a flight number. So in this case, I'm going to go with BA386, which if we just return back to our flight data. That was one of the flights we created here. And the passenger ID. Oops. So I'm going to use the ID from the one that was created earlier. If you're struggling a bit, then you can just see it here. There's that ID. So you can just run passengers again if you need to get hold of that ID. So now I'll run book flight, and that returns us true. So now, if I update this flights query, so rather than just showing us the numbers, the flight number, let's show some details of the passengers as well. So let's say the passenger name and run all flights. So here you can see we've got the flight number BA386 and we've got the passenger Bob, who's now been booked on. This flight still has no passengers, as you would expect. So these kind of results, if you're writing a mobile app, for example, and it had quite a small screen size, then you don't want to show much detail, so you'll just show the flight number possibly and the passengers. But this is where the power of GraphQL comes in. If you're writing a desktop app instead, so you've got a bit more space to use, or you can provide a bit more detail. So if I add in capacity and captain, which is that other field that are on our flights, and run it again, you can see here that we've added this in. So you can really, you specify exactly what you want to see when you're writing the query, and then that's the data that's returned there. So for completeness, I have included the ability to delete passengers, cancel bookings, and so on. But I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the reader of this. It's I've shown you what I've aimed to achieve really here. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the YouTube, and I'll try and answer them as best I can. Thank you very much. Just a couple of bits of advice I'd have for people in general. Like one of the gotchas is sometimes people try and implement security on the GraphQL level of things. The advice is not to do that. It should be further down in the business layer of logic, because there's one of the common flaws with GraphQL is having security holes in it because of the degree of freedom that people have to query things. So I've got a question on the use cases for GraphQL. So I'll just return to that slide. So essentially, anywhere where you might have an API, you can use it. So as I mentioned briefly, one of the gotchas is security. So you need to be careful about making sure your business layer has robust security in place. So there might be a reason not to use it. Also, if so in most cases, I would say GraphQL is quicker than using a traditional API because the client specifies exactly what they're after. So there's less data going over the wire that the client application doesn't use if you're having to maintain multiple APIs. So for example, often people have to have a separate API for the mobile application and the desktop application because there's different levels of data, and then you need to keep updating sorry, my mind's gone blank. You need to keep updating the API with other bits of information, which you can do quite freely on GraphQL and add to it, but the client doesn't. If the client isn't interested, it just doesn't ask for it. So there's that advantage. How long did it take for me to learn Go? So I think if you were to have a look at my data layer in detail, you would see there's quite a lot of not brilliant code there. So I wouldn't say I've learned Go that well, but it's reasonably strict. There's a few gotchas. So I come from a Java and a C# background. So there's a couple of gotchas, like the type of the variable goes after the name, and also it doesn't support generics, but there's plenty of talk about it supporting generics shortly, so hopefully it will in Go. So I think if you've got a good knowledge of object-oriented programming, you can learn Go in you'd at least get a pretty good handle on it in a couple of days. So I've got another question about what are the alternatives to GraphQL. So just a normal REST API, I would say, for if you don't want to use GraphQL. And the advantages of using GraphQL over other products. So as I was mentioning just before, it's about the client specifying exactly what they want to retrieve from the API. I think that's it in terms of questions. Thank you very much for attending. I think I went a bit too quickly at some places there, so feel free to rewind the YouTube and catch up. The infrastructure will be available for a little bit after this, the playground infrastructure, but afterwards you'll need to just set it up yourself, which you can find details for doing in the Readme if you're familiar with AWS. But thank you very much for attending. I hope you have a good evening.